G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 Fantasy video. Today I'm going to do a few price predictions for the upcoming F1 Fantasy season. I know we still have pre-season testing to come at the end of February, and realistically I think that will no doubt influence our team selections, but I did want to preview some popular drivers and constructors from last season, as well as some new faces that are joining or rejoining the grid. If you enjoy what you're seeing, like the video, hit subscribe, and let's rip into it. So the first cab off the rank is Max Verstappen, the man himself. He's the best driver on the grid. He's been in and around the top three in F1 Fantasy for the last 4 seasons the game has been live. I think his price will come in close to where it was last season, which was $34 million. He scored close to 900 points, which is a mammoth effort for any F1 fantasy asset. The next closest was Leclerc on 667. Realistically, I think if you're putting in scores like that across the season, averaging over 40 points per race, he is far and away the best asset and should be priced accordingly. Not only that, but Red Bull last year, after the first 3 races, was an extremely reliable outfit. Max did not have a DNF for the rest of the season, and he had the highest beat teammate percentage in race day and in qualifying of all drivers, only matched by Albon at 77%. So I think Max will be an excellent, in a vacuum, excellent fantasy option, but given the starting budget of 100 million, and as we observed last year, he just wasn't really practical to own throughout the season unless he's being mega driven on streaks or on sprint races. For those of you who paid close attention to the template last year, for many races it was double Ferrari drivers, Perez, and then Red Bull as the constructor to cover Max's output. I think, however, with a few more sprint races on the docket for 2023, I believe Max will feature in a few more teams this season. I don't think he will start in my team off the bat. 35 million is more than a third of your starting budget. And I think realistically, if I'm getting him in my team, that's compromising on depth. So unless sprint races or streaks do come up, I'll probably be avoiding him at least initially. The next driver that I want to talk about is Carlos Sainz. Last season, Sainz, and in 2021, had a breakout year for Ferrari. I think he will continue his efforts into 2023. For the last few races of the season, he was the primary turbo driver option for a lot of people. He finished the season at 19.4, and I think F1 and Play On should price him just over that $20 million mark. The reason I think 20.5 is a good price for Sainz is because, first of all, he's in a team that is competitive. It's a car that we know will be in the mix for podiums throughout the season. But at 20.5, if he gets off to a slow start and his price drops a little bit, then that opens the door for a lot of people to get him into their team to turbo drive him. And I think as well, he's not quite on the same level as Russell, Leclerc, and Perez as far as fantasy output is concerned. He was a really strong driver for Ferrari in 2021. He was, I would say, on average better than Leclerc. And then in 2022, the second half of the season particularly, he had a really strong finish to that year. He was rivaling Leclerc in qualifying and on race day for the last few races of the season. So I don't think the gap is as big between those two as it might be made out to be. But I think around that $20 million mark is a fair price for Sainz. Again, we have to wait for preseason testing to make an assessment as to whether he will feature in our teams based on the value of that price. But if he is in that turbo drivable territory, I think he will be a shoo-in for my team. The next driver I want to take a look at is Oscar Piastri. The reason being is because he is a driver that is new to F1, has dominated the lower divisions, F2, F3 particularly, really had some strong seasons, winning both before he had a year off last year. I think coming in at 9 million is probably a conservative price for him. He should definitely be priced above the rookies, and F1 Play On should err on the side of caution, price him a couple million higher than Sargent and De Vries, given they're going into weaker teams. I think, however, Norris will have his measure through certainly at least the first few races of the season as Piastri comes to grips with the car and the competition in general. It's a step above what he's been used to, so I think that will take a little bit of time to adjust. But he is going into a top 5 car on the grid, and if they churn out a car similar to 2021, that could even rival the top 3 teams. So I think 9 million. It might be a mockery of his value in the F1 fantasy landscape by the end of the season, but I think 9 million is a very fair assessment of what Piastri should be valued at. Historically, F1 have priced drivers similar to those that they have replaced, and one example of that would be Russell going to Mercedes to replace Bottas. Bottas finished the season around 24.5 million in 2021. Russell came in at 24 million flat last season. Ricciardo started 2022 at 14.5 and finished at around 6. I think Piastri should come in right in the middle there, and on average, that should really come out quite nicely given the performance of the car and his pedigree in the lower ranks. I also want to take a look at a few more drivers and constructors that interest me. Hamilton had a very disappointing 2022, as we're aware. His price in F1 Fantasy plummeted by almost 9 to 10 million. And I think that was just because of the fact that Mercedes had a very poor car to start the year. They really turned things around, and by the end of the season, I thought 22.9 was an absolute steal for someone of his pedigree. I think he'll come in at around that $27 million mark, down from the 31 from 2022. I still think he is far and away the second best driver on the grid. In the machinery that Mercedes is expected to put out for this upcoming season, they will be competitive from the get-go. And I have no doubt in my mind that Hamilton at 27 could prove good value over the course of the season if he rediscovers his form from 2021 and beforehand. As for Leclerc, I think him, Perez, and Russell will be priced within 1 million of each other. Perez obviously came in second in the drivers last year. Russell had his maiden win in Brazil. Leclerc had, on all accounts, a mixed bag of a season, but by standards of his previous years, a very strong one. I think he'll come in close to where he wrapped up 2022 at 25 million. Norris, assuming Sainz comes in above 20 million, will be probably the first name on my team sheet, given his ability to be turbo driven. He had a couple of really good races to close out last season, and at 16.5, I think that's a very fair price. He'll also have the added benefit of having a rookie as a teammate who will be acclimating to the car and to the grid. So I would expect Norris to really dominate his teammate in the first few races of the season and banking those beat teammate points in qualifying and on race day. Gasly, in a new car and a new team, the strongest team he's probably been in since his Red Bull days. I think he will come in below his starting price of last season. However, I do expect that him and Ocon will be pretty similarly priced. If he's able to rediscover the Pierre Gasly of old in a car that finished 4th overall last year, I have no doubt in my mind that 11.5 could be sensational value. But I would like to see him in the preseason testing and early on really put forward some solid performances that do warrant more attention. I think as for Hulkenberg, De Vries, and Sargent, they'll all be around the similar mark in terms of pricing. And I certainly from the get-go will probably be the number 2 drivers in those teams. Red Bull, Mercedes, and Ferrari, I think that price for each of them can be up in the air. It is quite subjective, but I think the thing that F1 and Play On need to seriously consider is allocating the correct pricing to these 3 constructors, that it makes each of them viable within their own right. Certainly from the first few races, and I think how we saw the last season start, the most affordable of the 3 really was part of the template for the first few races of the season. I expect that will no doubt continue unless we see things in preseason testing that we don't anticipate. Red Bull, if they do come in around that 40 million, which I think is reasonable given they had both drivers finish in the top 2 of the drivers. They won the Constructors and they proved to be the most reliable, or one of the most reliable cars on the grid. I think 40 million is a reasonable price, but will put me off from getting them to, at least initially. The only concern I have there is the lack of coverage for Max Verstappen. But again, I want to see more in preseason testing before I make an assessment on that. I think Mercedes, there has been a lot of speculation about the car they're putting out this season, but ultimately I do see them putting forward something that's much more competitive in 2023 compared to what we got in the first half of last season. And then as for Ferrari, they'll certainly be in the mix for podiums every single week. Again, they really exceeded expectations in preseason and in the first few races of last season. So I definitely think they're in good shape to replicate that form in 2023. So if there's any drivers or constructors on here that you don't like the look of, that you disagree with, let me know in the comments below. If there's any other drivers that you don't see on here that you want to ask me about, feel free to hit me up on YouTube and Twitter. And if you've liked what you've seen and you want to see more of it, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I'll see you all very soon.